Բարի երեկո սիրելիներ։ Շատ շնորհակալություն ձեր ներկայության համար։ Այսօր հայագիտական ուսման ծրագիրը պատիվը ունի հյուրընկալելու Dr. Ara Sanjian-ը. Hello and welcome to the Programme of Armenian Studies 4th academic event of 2018. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Ara Sanjian for accepting our invitation and speaking to us today for the third time this week. Let's keep it a roll. We're going to do another event tomorrow as well. Dr. Sanjian will be talking to us today about the Armenians during the Cold War, and specifically why Armenian historians and intellectuals in general tend to avoid this issue. Dr. Sanjian is an associate professor of Armenian and modern Middle Eastern history and the director of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan. His wealth of experience includes being chairman of the Department of Armenian Studies, History and Political Science at the Henry Kazan Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies at California State University. Dr. Sanjian's research interests focus on the post-World War I history of Armenia, Turkey, and the Arab states of Western Asia. He's an author of the book Turkey Anti-Arab Neighbors, 1953 to 1958, as well as 2 monographs and several scholarly articles and book chapters, published in English, Armenian, Russian, and French. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Sanjian to give us his presentation today. Thank you.
Good evening, and it's very exciting to be able to talk about this topic in public for the first time ever since we had the conference. And I hope that it will get a number of viewings on YouTube, because this is really where technology helps you to transcend local barriers. And so technically, Armenian Studies has paid very little attention to the history of both Soviet Armenia and that of the Armenian communities worldwide during the period 1945 to 1991. And toward the end of this lecture, I will try to explain why there is this neglect, which to some extent is also an intentional neglect, but I think it can be explained why. And because my PhD dissertation here in SOAS many years ago was about this period, so although not dealing specifically with Armenians, while I was doing research in what is now called the British National Archives, what was then the Public Record Office, I come across also accidentally to a lot of interesting material about the Armenians in this period. And at the suggestion of one of my friends, I also copied them, although they were of no immediate relevance to my own topic. Since then, of course, I tried to build up on that. And of course, as a historian, I'm always curious to think about things that others have not touched upon it before. But in any case, it's not that kind of a topic that gets a lot of encouragement within the Armenian community for you to talk about. In any case, the Cold War in international parlance is the period which extends from the end of World War II, 1945. Some people put it from 1943, depending on different scholars. They say that its seeds were already there in the summits that happened in Tehran, Yalta, and then Potsdam, and ends with the final disintegration of the Soviet Union towards the end of 1991. So we're talking about 45 years of international history, about which a lot has been written worldwide. And focusing on how the Armenians fared during this period is also very interesting, not only for Armenians, but also for historians of the Cold War globally in general. Because in recent decades, most Cold War histories are asserting the fact that while initially, and perhaps understandably, the interest was on the superpower conflict, specifically in Europe, and maybe a little bit also in Asia during the first stages of the Cold War, more and more Cold War historians are realizing that sooner other parts of what we now call the developing world, or the decolonized world, or the third world as it was called once, they were also sucked into this conflict, willingly or unwillingly. And the historical baggage of the various conflicts in those areas also were brought into the broader framework of the Cold War. So it's when you're dealing with any international conflict, any proxy conflict, for the period between 1945 and 1991, not only you should look into it from the context of US-Soviet rivalry, NATO-Warsaw Pact rivalry, but also within the local baggage of that conflict. And sooner or later, both the Americans and the Soviets realized that they cannot really reduce any conflict into simply by being pro-West or pro-East, because many of these local conflicts were very much entangled with local nationalistic and other issues. So Armenians also fit into this category because they also entered the Cold War period with already an established baggage, which basically had to adapt itself to the new global Cold War environment. Armenians are to some extent a rare case because you can look at their involvement in the Cold War from a number of dimensions, very broadly two. First, Soviet Armenia was one of the Union republics of the Soviet Union, and hence part it was directly involved in the Cold War as a component of Soviet society, and also had its role in Soviet foreign policy shaping. Secondly, also it was the Armenian diaspora, which was the outgrowth of a problem from the previous war, that of the genocide. And then, of course, it had its own agenda predating the Cold War, which was basically holding Turkey accountable for it was done and try to repair the situation as much as it was possible. So in that case, there was a separate agenda. But during the period of 1945 to 1991, there was also another continuity in the Armenian diaspora, the issue of how to deal with the Soviet regime in Armenia, a problem which had arisen first in the 1920s. So we had all these issues coming together, and that's basically, these are the axes around which the Cold War period history of Armenians is built on, and these are the prisms to which we have to look and try to interpret what was happening. So if you're a global Cold War historian or a historian of the Armenians, these are the issues that you should probably focus on. One, the foreign policies of the Central Soviet government in Moscow, and also the Soviet Armenian Republican leadership in Yerevan toward Turkey, its NATO allies, and the Armenian diasporan communities in the non-communist world. It is not always that communists in Armenia saw eye to eye with the communists in Moscow. Now we all know that. At many times they try to shape and influence Moscow, and also they have to try to sometimes circumvent and polish what the Moscow policies were for local Armenian interests. And in the Soviet archives, we have such clashes, between the central authorities and, for example, local authorities, or even at a very low case, like, for example, in those embassies of the Soviet Union in various parts of the world where Armenian diplomats were placed, Lebanon, Greece, Iran, etc., France, we always even had sometimes friction between the Russian and other diplomats on the other one hand and the Armenian diplomats in their dealings with the local community. There is already enough published evidence for this, for us to explore these issues further and maybe find new evidence through memoirs and other things that will come up. Secondly, of course, while people write quite a lot about Soviet policies inside Armenia and how they evolved, how the global Cold War shaped the evolution of those policies is not really paid much attention to. So usually I've seen relatively little among the works of post-Soviet historians in Armenia analyzing changes and shifts in the Soviet policy inside Armenia as regards the economy, how to treat local nationalism, etc., by taking into consideration also the changing global Cold War environment, which shaped Moscow's overall policy first, and that has its own effect on the policy in Armenia per se. So that is also a dimension that has to be added. Now, if we switch to the diaspora, it's basically history of various Armenian organizations in the diaspora and the way they dealt with the Soviet regime and the Soviet regime dealt with them. That's one, but also those organizations were often rivals within the various diasporan communities, and how their relationship was shaped by also adding the interaction with the Soviet system. So often it became a triangular kind of a relationship rather than a very classical rivalry had the Soviet factor been absent in that. So these are the issues that have to be taken into account by looking at every single episode in Armenian history at the time. 2 years ago, in April 2016, the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, where I work, we tried to launch a discussion on this by organizing a 2.5-day conference on Armenians and the Cold War. We had something like 20 or more presentations, and I am still in the process of trying to edit them. And we have the commitment from the journal, the Armenian Review, that it will come up as a special issue. And I don't know how quickly, but probably within the next 2 or 3 years, it will be ready for publication. And the other one, which I'm talking openly for the first time, is that I have decided and have tried to solve the technical part of it, but we have not actually begun the physical work, is also to establish an online source book of Armenians and the Cold War on the site of the Armenian Research Center, where some of the key documents used by the participants in the conference will be published in full, and we will also add. The idea is to give a very broad view of life and changing politics and policies in the Cold War era, and we will produce text and photos and cartoons, previously classified diplomatic material which is now available, also editorials, public statements by various groupings, maybe short pieces of memoirs where one figure tells about an important episode or that. So this is actually what I think that gradually we'll try to build up. And I will try to do this interactive in the sense that once the initial set is ready, hopefully within a year or less, we will publish a certain quantity of material, but then say it's open, and we will invite people to suggest other documentation, which we'll review, and if we like it and we consider it important, we will publish those as well, and add today at whose suggestion this has been added, and maybe do some slight translation that these documents at least should be available in English and Armenian at least. But the originals will try to publish it in its original language, whatever that original language is, whether it's Russian, Spanish, Arabic, or French or whatever, depending on which part of the world that we are talking. But we'll not commit to also having them translated into those languages. So it's a long project, but we hope that it will build up sufficient interest over the years in order to focus on this period. Moreover, we know that history is no longer just political, intellectual, military, and diplomatic history. And we know that we also have to look at history from a sociological and cultural viewpoint, so that we will have social history. That's a bit challenging thing, how to write social history through a global Cold War prism, though writing cultural history probably will be easier. And in a way, so these things also will be in our conference. We had, for example, issues of popular culture discussed. We discussed also how it affected historiography and things. So we're not only going to confine ourselves to talking only about political developments, political chronology, and try to explain what people did and why. So that's why, as I said, a number of disciplines will come into this project: political history, intellectual history, historiography, international relations, that's more theoretical. Literature is something that I'm interested in, although we never had any application to write about how the Cold War affected Armenian literature. We had, however, how it affected the arts. It was more about how it affected leftist shaping and choices of art schools, etc., by certain Armenian artists and their political convictions and backgrounds, and, as I said, popular culture. And our paper was from on period in Armenia, about how the local Armenian press, the Soviet Armenian press, responded to the hippie movement, and certain attempts in Armenia to replicate the movement in one way or another in Armenia. It was a very interesting presentation, and I hope it will be published soon. And also, of course, the same things can be looked within the diasporan settings as well. Moreover, at some stage, once we have enough material, I'm sure there will be comparative studies comparing Armenians with other cases. And I certainly like comparative because it really opens new dimensions for you to think, which in a standalone way you will miss probably when you're studying a topic, and also theory refinement if people in international relations basically want to use the Armenian experience as well to refine what is already being suggested. I will also already refer to some of these existing theories and how the Armenians fit into it in my lecture, but of course I'm not an IR expert, so I know that other people will be able to do that aspect of it much better than I will ever be able to do it. But the first issue is the issue of the Cold War globally and on an Armenian case. Most global Cold War books, of course, start paying a lot of attention from 1945, but definitely they have to write about the Second World War. And sooner or later, they also have to write about the rise of communism. And many of them say that they have to also write about the American approach to the world and these American ideas of, exporting the American model to the rest of the world. So in that case, you can go back as early as the late 19th century, where these ideologies, which clashed very strongly after 1945, were taking shape in America, and in the case of socialism, communism in Europe and Russia. So if we look at that there is always a pre-Cold War period which is relevant. The Armenian case is also very important. If you look at it simply from the ideological perspective and not necessarily from the geopolitical perspective, then the Armenian Cold War began in 1920 or 21. Because ultimately, if you have to decide whether the socialist system was better than the non-socialist system, in a way, Armenians faced that choice as soon as Armenia was Sovietized in late 1920. This, of course, was very important among the Armenian diasporan communities because people in Armenia had not much choice. So you can talk about Soviet policies and history of dissent in Soviet Armenia, but when it came to the diasporan communities, and after the First World War, basically there were 4 regions in the world where Armenians were concentrated. And so there were enough Armenians for us to look at these issues in a regional sense. One is the Americas, North America and South America. The other one was France, basically, in Western Europe. And you also have the Middle East or the Eastern Mediterranean, which of course I would put the Greek community closer to the Middle Eastern Mediterranean community more rather than attach them to Western Europe and France. And we know how important Greece was as an Armenian community until the Second World War. Of course, it remains still a relatively vibrant community, but its size has declined very sharply from what it used to be. So any analysis, we have to study these together. And it's very interesting that there are regional differences because the host countries and host environments were different, but also there are commonalities because the Armenian political parties which survived the genocide remained transnational. They kept unified leadership, and those leaderships influenced local decisions by their branches within the various communities. So to see this interaction is very important. And this can be compared very broadly with the way, as I think those textbooks look about the relationship between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union prior to 1941. 1941 here being the period when the Soviets were forced to change sides, when Hitler attacked on them and to some extent forced a first British-Soviet alliance, which was an ad hoc alliance against a common foe. But then, of course, America also joined in simply because Hitler decided to declare war on America, and probably that was one of his big mistakes. And in any case, so that created an environment. But as we know, that relationship remained ad hoc, and it could not survive the defeat of Hitler because all the early antagonisms came back again. So in that sense, The Armenian Cold War history is similar to the world situation, that you have some level of rivalry based on the issue of ideology. In the conference, this issue was raised, and it has to be refined further. Most of the participants said that we cannot call it a Cold War, and one of the participants said we should use the word turf war, in which different rival political parties try to position themselves. But the problem also in the Armenian diaspora has always been also a process of balance of power, in the sense that the Tashnag party, or the ARF, has been the single most powerful party. And it basically took an anti-Soviet stand because it was kicked out of Armenia as a ruling party by the Bolsheviks. Now, the other coalition which was built up, which became anti-Tashnag and to some extent pro-Soviet, is not a very strong ideological idea, and it could not be explained unless if you take the balance of power into consideration. All the others joined together so as not to be basically totally sidelined by the Tashnags, and you have a very wide range of pro-Soviet feelings in the Armenian diaspora, from die-hard communists to Hanchagians who are almost communist, to Hanchagians who are less communist, to then to go to AGBU and the Ramgavars, who would basically say that we are with this system only because Russia offers protection, because Echmiadzin is there, and totally consider the ideological dimension of the Soviet regime as relevant. But it's also interesting, despite saying this, in the end they usually take pro-Soviet positions when looking at the global crises in the world as well. So that's also very interesting in the case of the Ramgavars, which I think should be analyzed in a way how they did it. And as I said, because these parties existed in most of the Armenian diasporan communities, not all of them. You know, their rivalries did touch upon and influence local politics in almost every locality. Probably Turkey is one of the few exceptions, but you have these parties in France, you have these parties and their followers in the Balkans, in North America, in South America, in the Eastern Mediterranean, etc. So it's a very kind of broad thing. And the issues that they discussed is the Soviet regime an asset or an obstacle to Armenia's socioeconomic development? But what about the security component? What about the interrelationship between communist rule in Russia, USSR, and the geopolitical dimension of the Russian protectorate of Armenia? So this was also another issue which completely becomes tied up. Are you with Soviet Armenia because it's under Russian protection, or are you with Soviet Armenia because you like socialism? So there were different ways of emphasizing that relationship. And then the issue, were the Soviets attempting to gain support among the Armenians in diaspora through espionage or other means, something which the Tashnag side claimed from moment one, while the others said it was very exaggerated. And it is very interesting that most of the attention so far in the scholarship has been on Soviet attempts to influence Armenians through espionage and other means, and not the other way around. Although, and not necessarily because there is no evidence, but there has been the interest to search for that kind of evidence as well. So that is also something that has to be looked into further in the future. And as I said, these rivalries, which were quite common all across the Armenian diaspora, were fought at varying levels of intensity and acuteness. So not every place you have the same level of sharp division or lack of cooperation. And prior to 1939, probably the sharpest divide emerged in America. That was in 1933, when first the church was divided, and as a result of that emerging division, the prelate was also assassinated as he was, participating in mass in the church on Christmas Eve, something which has divided the Armenian communities in America up until now. A few years ago, one of the prelates said, well, it was all the Bolsheviks who did it. Well, I didn't know him that closely, otherwise I would have said, they're gone for 25 years. Have we gone forward 25 inches. To some extent, at the popular level, living in America have, but the structures that have been so much enshrined, there is so much power and prestige that it's probably very difficult to think that one of the churches in any city will give up its own power as parish councils, etc., in order for the sake of Armenian unity. Although, as I said, people now visiting one another's churches, etc., has become much more common compared to the very stark realities that the Armenians in America faced in the 1930s and 40s. Even when I went to America in 2006, one of my first tests by one side was whether I knew about the assassination of Archbishop Turian. And when I said that I knew about it, it was a stamp of approval. It was a bit funny, but I understand that it has been such an important experience in the life of that community, although those people are all now dying, and people who were alive in 1933 or in a way are much, much less in evidence in society than they are now. In any case, as in the same way as the Second World War was something like an interlude in the rivalry between, let's call it the capitalist West and the socialist East, because of the rise of Hitler, the Second World War period is also to some extent an interlude in the Armenian Cold War. And here the nationalistic element comes in. From 1943 to 1947, we see a change in the priorities of the Tashnak Party. They become much less anti-socialist. Even to some extent, they start welcoming Soviet contributions to Armenia's progress, etc. But at the back of their minds is the hope that the Soviet win will also lead into the changing of borders with Turkey, and Armenians will benefit from this. This is very interesting in the sense that we have forgotten about this, but and I really want somebody else to do this because I don't have the time, but I was studying something else related to Lebanese politics in the late 1930s. I was reading the local Armenian newspapers, and by the 1937, all three parties in Lebanon did have their own separate newspapers. And as the Versailles system disintegrates, from Anschluss to Munich to the occupation of Czechoslovakia and its divisions, there are a number of articles in the Armenian press, which we have totally forgotten, that how this disintegration of the Versailles system could it benefit the Armenians? The Versailles system is no longer sacrosanct. There is a new division of the world map, and will the Armenians get anything out of it? Of course, then comes World War II, and of course, all these things are put on the back burner. But by 1943, after Stalingrad and maybe after Kursk, things get more active. And I have chosen the photo of Simon Varatsian here, although he was much older in the 1940s than in this photo, because the early signs suggest that he was very pivotal in the Tashnak Party to push forward with this new relationship of trying to forge some kind of an understanding with the Soviets, hoping that the Armenians will benefit with territorial expansion at the end of the war. And it is very interesting that the Armenian National Committee, which was just being organized, it is now, of course, a very important grassroots Tashnak organization, it even wrote to the Soviet Armenian Foreign Ministry offering its services in this, and the letter was never restated. They never received any reply, but it has been preserved in the archives of the Foreign Ministry and has been published. So in a way, even there was this kind of readiness to go. And during the same period, when Armenians were hoping that the Soviet demands for territory for Kars and Ardahan will even transcend Kars and Ardahan, and usually the Armenians asked for the severed borders, although the Soviets always stuck to demanding Kars and Ardahan, was one moment where the hope of change of borders was the only one which came to be close to being realistic after 1920, and it was at the same time that the repatriation was organized. The exact link between repatriation and the territorial demand has been assumed, but I still have not found very strong links to say that they were part of the same policy. I think partly because scholars in Armenia, probably for economic reasons more than anything, are not spending enough time in the Moscow archives in the recent 25 years, where probably more can be found, or maybe because all these decisions were made in the mind of Stalin and there is not much paperwork to be left behind as well. But this is something that we have to do. So up until 1946-47, there was this expectation. But as we all know, there was a stiff opposition by the West to the Soviet demands. We now know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the Soviets were much more serious than people were thought in actually attacking and annexing Kars and Ardahan. Most people up until 10, 20 years ago thought it was just a ploy to have more concessions on the issue of governing passage through the straits. But then, of course, these demands had to be dropped because Stalin knew that he could not start a war which will be destructive for both sides, to say the least, and probably also destructive basically for the Soviet Union. And in this case, the reason why there was this rapprochement for a few years was destroyed, and then we come back to where things were. So again, we have an interlude here, but here, of course, it's not Hitler, it's the hope that the Soviet victory in the war will lead to expansions of Armenian borders, which creates this interlude. And it goes on for a number of years. And in that sense, the disillusionment, especially of the Tashnag side, plays a very important role. Now with hindsight, it seemed ready to work with the Soviets. It was rebuffed. Moreover, willingly or unwillingly, the repatriation campaign in 1946 to 48 became in the various Armenian communities a tool for anti-Tashnag forces to wage a psychological and ideological struggle against the Tashnags, at a time when the Tashnag ideology was not in a very strong way. And this is very interesting. Did these orders to isolate the Tashnags, not to include them in these repatriation committees, demanding that their members hand in official resignations, did these things come from Moscow, from Yerevan, or were they local initiatives? We don't know. It has to be studied in detail. I know one thing, that in 1962, during the second wave of immigration, the Soviets were very careful not to involve the local communities in the immigration campaign. And so they used to send their own representatives to places like Cyprus, Egypt, Syria, and Iran, the major places from where repatriation happened after 1962. And these people working in the local Soviet embassies dealt one-to-one with everybody who wanted to go. And there was no local organization, committee or whatever, organizing this. So there was a big difference between 1946-48 and after 1962. That has also to be seen, and it's also a part of Soviet strategy and Cold War history about how you organize your relationship with the local Armenian organizations in the various diasporan communities. But just as the disagreement over how to deal with defeated Germany led to the Cold War in Europe, disillusionment with the territorial claims as they were not successful, plus the divisions created by the repatriation campaign, the fact that it soon became evident that many of them who had gone were unhappy with what they found there in Armenia, all of these led into a renewed period of antagonism. And probably it's either 1947 or some people say 1948 that we have to consider as the beginning of the Cold War. During our conference 2 years ago, there was this discussion. I myself was for 1947 as a beginning, and my line of reasoning was based on my reading of Lebanese politics. There were others who suggested 48, and I will come to that later. My reasoning is that if you look at the various campaign slogans that are used by the various parties in Lebanon, because in Lebanon you have places allocated for the Armenian community in the national legislature, so Armenian parties compete with one another and they try to attract Armenian voters to vote for them. So what do they accuse of one another? I realized that prior to 1943, and in 1943, there is very little evidence of the communist card being used by the Tashnaks against the Ramgavars and Hanchagians. They make references, but it's not that kind of, you are fellow travelers, or the word that they try to use, especially for the Ramgavars and Hanchagians, Kogadzadzug. That is that the person who has covered himself with some kind of veil in order to hide its communism. From 1947 to 1960, in all the electoral campaigns, the Tashnaks always attacked their opponents as being communist, fellow travelers. The word stooges does not have its Armenian equivalent, but essentially the communist card is played very well. After 1966, from 1964, it stops again. So for me, that period in Lebanese is important because the communism card is one of the important things when you use. And the elections in Lebanon were held in March 1947, and the communist card was being used, although in 1947, still the repatriation campaign was continuing. And people thought that it will continue for a number of years. It stopped suddenly in 1948. Other people used to say no, and their argument is the book by Vahan Navasartyan, who was the chief ideologue of the Tashnak party at the time, at least the person who wrote most extensively. And he has the book about the Straits, Negutznera, published in 1947, in which basically he's still offering a deal with the Soviets, saying that essentially we don't have anything in essence against the Soviet system, except that up until now it has been detrimental to Armenian national interests. And if that changes, there's no problem. Now, one thing that I have to do is to look which month of the year Negutznera came out, which I have not done so, but that will be one of my tasks in the coming months or years, going through newspapers and looking to references on in which month that book came out. And some people say that that's not it. In the fall of 1947, the Tashnak Party did organize its first World Party Congress after the war. And there you see initial signs of tilting towards the Western camp. And that becomes much stronger. A very critical person here at this juncture of the early stages of the Cold War, I'm not saying he's the only one, but one of the major ones is General Dro, or Rastamat Ganayan, a really controversial figure in Armenian history who has a number of biographies written about him, but there's still a lot to write about him because he's really, really interesting and a controversial figure and leads to many interpretations. Unfortunately, all that we have so far are hagiographies, which do not necessarily give us the whole picture of the complexity of the age, before even the complexity of the individual. Thoreau had actually cooperated with the Nazis, and that is still an issue of controversy up until now. I know my dad, who worked for the British Army, he was not a soldier, but he worked for the British Army in Palestine. He could not stand because he thought that he was on the wrong side, and my dad, he thought, on the right side of the Allies. So may he rest in peace. And it was very difficult to have a historical argument with a person who was passionately committed to a cause in his youth, and he's trying to defend a commitment and a decision that he made in his young years, and he was happy that he ended up on the right side of things. So he had that. He was absolved by the Tashnak Party leadership for what he had done. Whether he had done on his own or under orders, we do not know. That also is a controversy. I still felt it was more an ad hoc local decision rather than part of a grand strategy, pre-war strategy by the Tashnak Party. And then, of course, Thoreau starts working with the CIA. And we now have at least something like over 30 documents declassified by the CIA, which tell about that relationship. So we know roughly about what they were working on. And gradually the Tashnak Party tilts towards the West And that continues in 1951 and 55. 55 is a crescendo, if you look at the statements of being the... And then, of course, it starts declining again after 1959. So technically, whether it's 47 or 48, that's the problem. But essentially, we have a new period where there is what I will use the hot part of the Armenian Cold War, if we can use that kind of a pun. And the 1947 globally is also a very important year. It's the year of the Truman Doctrine, George Kennan's very famous X article about containing Soviet power, the Marshall Plan, the counter plan by Molotov of how to rebuild Europe, the formation of the Cominform, and Andrei Zhanov's very famous report, which counteracts the Kennan's X article of talking about two camps and irreconcilable differences. So all these things were happening in the world as there were elections in Lebanon, and as Dava Sartian was writing the book about the Straits, and the Tashnak Party was organizing its regular party conference after the war. So all these probably have to be tied together to try to create a ball-by-ball account of how things changed as each month, developments happened. But then comes the major issue, yet again. Was there anything different from what occurred after 1947 for what was there before 1939? This is difficult to argue. Nicolas Shahgeldian says there is. In his unpublished PhD dissertation about the Armenians in Lebanon, he used Tashnak Party archives. And he argues that there was a major difference. And that major difference comes in 1951 from a Tashnak perspective. He said never before had the Tashnak Party said that it is permissible to cooperate with non-Armenian political forces to fight local Armenian rivals. And in 1951, that was done. So that's one part of the story. To what extent was American and Soviet involvement more from 1947 onwards than what was the case before in 1939? For example, myself being more focused on the Middle East, like the French mandatory authorities, how did they look at that problem from the viewpoint of local politics and to keep the mandate in France and mandate of France in Lebanon and Syria, and how to control the Armenian factions as well. My feeling is that they really did not necessarily give the Tashnaks much preference against the non-Tashnaks, but again, these are very preliminary, and I reserve to change my opinion if I find something more. A student that I know who worked on the Armenian community in Lebanon, and he was not Armenian, and asked me to comment on his dissertation, and he had used mostly American consular reports, gave me something which is very, very interesting, that he wrote pages and pages about Armenian communists in Lebanon, and only a few pages about the other Armenian parties. And my idea was that the communists were a small group compared to the followers of the Tashnak, Hanchagian, and Ramgavar parties. This shows the American perspective that they were more interested in collecting material about the tiny group of communists rather than about the whole Armenian community with various shades. And just look at how many votes did the communist candidates get when they ran on their own. They got very few, while Hanchagians and Ramgavars and Tashnaks got hundreds and hundreds of votes, because at least prior to the repatriation, all of them had large numbers of supporters in the Lebanese and the Syrian context. And elections could have gone either way, and did go either way at various times. So this is also a very, very important question about pre-Cold War and the Cold War differences. So these are, as I think, some of the major points that I have to look into. During the age of sharp polarization among the pro-Western Tashnaks and their pro-Soviet rivals, Hanchagians, Ramgavars, AGBU, etc. From about 1947 to the early 1960s, which is, to what extent did each camp endorse the ideals of its superpower patron? Did they just parrot what they were saying, or there were differences? One of my interesting things that I raised during the conference was we had a panel on America after World War II. And we had 3 or 4 scholars. None of them knew Armenian, and all of them had used English language sources. Hyrenic Weekly, Armenian Weekly, and State Department documentation. So my argument was that if you drop the Armenian Weekly and Armenian Mirror Spectator and instead use Hyrenic and Baykar and Le Rappel, will you get the same arguments? Unfortunately, these scholars are in no position to answer that question because of the language barrier. But this has to be done. For in Lebanon, I know that Armenians write one thing in Armenian and another thing in Arabic, and probably in other communities also there is a change of emphasis, and these things are very important to do. I remember years ago, Professor Virginia Svazlian had come to Azerbaijani University where I used to work, and she was giving a very interesting lecture about the repatriates who went to Armenia. And she, being one of those young children who accompanied her parents to Armenia, etc. She also had brought in a lot of pictures, probably from the family album and from those of the others, of all those ships that were taking these repatriates. She, of course, doesn't know Arabic. And we are just sitting, and all the audience, of course, we all know Arabic and Armenian, and we're reading all those slogans on the ships in Armenian and in Arabic. The ones in Arabic are all about brotherhood between Armenians and Egyptians, Armenians and Lebanese, Armenians and Syrians. And if you read the Armenian ones, it's Father Stalin, your children are coming to your bosom, and these kind of long live Soviet Armenia, etc. And everybody starts smiling and laughing. And Professor Svazia says, why? Because that's the difference. So I'm sure this is another aspect of it that we have to look. You're torn between two lands, you're torn between two different discourses. A colleague of mine in Lebanon, he says, you cannot survive as a minority unless you have a little bit of hypocrisy. Maybe that's a bit too much exaggerated, but that's the exigencies of life. So all these things have to be taken into consideration. And these kind of comparative discourses in Armenian and in the language of the host country should also be taken into consideration. Then, to what extent did the superpowers or the other non-communist host states, because I don't know if we have to study the Bulgarians and Romanians as special cases, I'm not a Balkan expert, how they dealt with their own Armenians as different from the Soviets in the Soviet Union, how much effort did they make to gain support among the Armenians? And for why? Again, these are very open questions, and Felix is here. And ever since he published that list on the Mitrokhin file a few months ago, I have done quite a lot of work trying to identify many of these people. And especially in Lebanon and in America, actually I've met one of them, and all I got was just a laugh and laugh and laugh, and he didn't want to talk more about that. He said, your name is there? I know, you know. But in any case, but in other cases, my own understanding of looking at the Lebanese case is that the Soviets were more interested not in having information, if that is an exclusive list, I know it's not. If that is a typical list of who their agents were, they were more interested in getting in touch with Armenians who could bring in information about more broader non-Armenian things, rather than they wanted information about the local parties and who was powerful or whatever. Because we tried to identify, identifying these people with people who knew them, in a way, what kind of information could they have provided to the Soviet embassy through their work, to their connections, etc. So that's also another important thing, is to see that to what extent were the two superpowers interested. That has to be a separate study, you know. US foreign policy and the Americans during the Armenians in the Cold War, or Soviet foreign policy and the Armenians in. So these are, of course, issues that have not ever been studied, and there is a lot of room to work on these issues. And there is the very simplistic question which we hear. Who is to blame? Because now that Armenians condemn the Cold War era, there are two entities which are blamed. It's an either-or situation. Nobody blames the AGBU, the Ramgavas, and Hanchagians for starting the Cold War. The Tashnags blame the Soviet regime, and the non-Tashnags in diaspora blame the Tashnags. Now, it's also very interesting. It all depends on the earlier question. How serious were the Soviets about the Armenians? And this is also another issue that probably will, if we go into discussing this, will create a lot of problems. In the same way as globally, there is the issue of who started the Cold War, which has volumes and volumes of studies and written about this and publications of documents, and still there is no single woman saying whether it was Stalin, whether it was the West, or whether it was unwilling outcome of the mutual fears without any one of them actually pushing for it, etc. So that's also very important. I personally, at this early stage, again, I reserve to change my mind if I find other documentation, I am more inclined to blame the Soviet Union rather than Tashnak Party. But some people say no, because they blame me for exaggerating the Soviet level of involvement, and they say, it's basically, it was just an opportunity for the Tashnak Party to solicit help from the host governments to dominate the local communities. Again, these are open things. I don't want to take stands on this fully, because I'm just showing you that how much there is for us to study about this period in the past. And then we have the period of the hot years. And for me, the hot years from 1947 to the early 60s, it varies from one community to another. Not all of them changed at the same place. In the Middle Eastern context, my argument is that the change occurs in 1959. I will talk about it a little bit, but I know that in America it was much later. I know somebody to do that kind of comparison for Latin America. And in Western Europe, the Cold War was milder in any case. So probably its issues are much less contested. From 1947 to 1953, it's a period of relative Soviet disengagement from what we call the Third Cold War. Stalin basically did not pursue a lot of effort in the Middle East and in other countries. But we know that Stalin always had plans for a possible war against Turkey. This is also, there is a lot of scattered evidence here and there, and nobody has actually tried to study it in detail. And I would just say a few things that I know. In 1948, for example, in textbooks published in Soviet Armenia, there is for the first time ever since 1920 a statement which says, the descendants of the survivors of the massacres of World War I are scattered all over the world, and they demand their ancestral lands to be returned to Soviet Armenia. This was 1948. The previous edition of the same textbook doesn't have this. The following edition doesn't have. So the change of that, even one paragraph in the same geography textbook, is a way it's very interesting that even after stopping the pursuance on the international level, they wanted to keep that interest. And that has been written a lot about this, that the Soviets, after failing to obtain what they wanted from Iran in 1947 and from the Turkey, they continued encouraging at the cultural level Azerbaijani and Armenian irredentism. I know there was Georgian irredentism in that period as well. I don't know Georgian, and I don't know whether it ever continued after 1947, but we know that in Armenia it continued to poetry, poetry by Gabodikyan and Barir Sevag and Hovhannes Shiraz. All these things were written, underlying basically this idea that these lands are Armenians, although not saying we should get them back, but inculcating these people that these were historical Armenian lands which were lost. And in Azerbaijan, we have the same thing, which continues up until now, that the Araks River is a dagger which cuts through the heart of Azerbaijan, and southern Azerbaijan should become unified with northern Azerbaijan. And of course, Baku should control Tabriz, not the other way around. But in any case, that is something that has been built up from the 1940s up, and it has gotten its life of its own in Azerbaijan as well. So all these things, of course, have to be taken. One of the Armenian ethnographers, she wrote a book about repatriation and has one footnote, and I want to pursue that with her if I get time one day in Armenia. She says that Armenian soldiers who knew Turkish and were conscripts, that is the sons of the repatriates, were all brought together into one battalion so that they might be used in the war together. Again, I really don't know. I want, if some of those who served in that, to tell what they want to do, or whether it was an exaggeration, but that's also another small point. And finally, we have the very famous story of Karekin Nishte, who had worked with the Nazis during the Second World War. And we know that when he was arrested by the Soviets in Bulgaria, we have all his interrogation now that he's a national hero, was a national hero by the Republican Party in Armenia, the party in power until 2 weeks ago, or 2 or 3 weeks ago. He basically says, I am ready to fight with the Soviet Union if you fight Turkey. And this is mid-1940s. And suddenly in 1951 or 52, he's brought from Siberia back to Yerevan for 1 month and asked to write a letter to Simon Baratsian saying that, are you ready to fight with the Soviet Union against Turkey if the Soviet Union declares war on Turkey? It's very interesting that this letter is being written at where the diaspora and Tashnak press is writing in 1952 in Lebanon, for example, that World War III is inevitable, and in World War III we are on the sides of the West against communists, etc. But the Soviets probably were trying, I think we can play on Armenian nationalism to get them on our own side. So this is a very kind of complex issue. But the whole idea is that all these things were beneath the surface and did not really affect that. What happens is that when the Soviet Union opens up under Khrushchev, then you will have really the hottest period of the Cold War in Lebanon, Syria, the Middle East, etc. But it does not really go much into Western Europe or South America. Of course, North America had been divided in any case well before that. And this is because the Khrushchev administration thinks that it can make inroads into the Third World much more than the previous Stalin administration does. And here, of course, Armenians also become interested. And for the Soviet Armenian, opening up to the Armenian diasporan communities also becomes an opportunity. And this is where I said we have to look into to what extent the local Yerevan expectations were different from the Moscow expectations within that. It's the period of continuing Tashnak-US cooperation under Tero, and unfortunately or accidentally, that cooperation turns not only against communism, but also against radical pan-Arab nationalism of Nasser. And this is where you have an internal discord within the Tashnak party as well. People saying that anti-communism is being applied in such a way that the local Arab peoples are thinking that we are against their own aspirations. And so that also goes on. Then, of course, the apex of that is the crisis of the Armenian Catholicos in Antillas, 4 years of wrangling to elect the Catholicos. An important chunk of the community refuses the legitimacy of the elected Catholicos. Then that elected Catholicos tries to extend the jurisdiction of the Catholicosate in different parts of the world. And so all these, of course, is a very tense period that in Lebanon, when it comes in 1958, then the Lebanese civil war erupts. The Lebanese government loses its control, its monopoly of violence, then the Armenians also get violent against one another. And according to my estimates, I know some people put much higher figures, but I think that they're wrong. Anything between 35 and 40 Armenian men, all of them women, there was no woman, are assassinated in tit-for-tat killings. And one reason is that there is nobody in the Armenian community who can bring the two sides together on a table because the community is so divided to try to find the solution. It's only when the Lebanese civil war ends, the new Lebanese Ministry of the Interior actually brings the Armenians together and forces them to stop. And I've had, for example, people who told me oral histories of where those meetings held. One of them said it was in the house of my uncle, and I remember the minister came in and this came, etc. So all these kind of things, this was an extreme fragmentation. But when I say in the Middle East, it's 1959, and I see that also as from the elections of 60 onward, things start changing. It's in 1959 in the Middle Eastern context. This does not apply to the other parts. But so the history of the other regions that I've talked about have to be studied separately. But by this time, Lebanon especially is becoming very influential as the new center of the Lebanese diaspora after the demise of Egypt under the Nasser regime. In 1959, a very critical moment is Nasser's public break with communists. It occurs in very late 1958, when Nasser openly attacked communists for the first time. There was underlying rivalry going back to at least a year and a half, but this was never made open. This really gives the Tashnak party a great opportunity to reposition itself. Within 1 month, Azdag writes, I think, 2 or 3 editorials, plus another very extensive article, not as an editorial, all on the same theme, saying we have nothing against Arab national aspirations, we have nothing against what President Nasser wants. We were only afraid that Nasser will be fooled by the communists. Now he has realized that, he knows that the communists are their enemies, communists are our enemies, so we have no problem. And this is a very important thing. They reposition themselves in Lebanese, Syrian, and other kind of politics. And up until now, they remain a very pan-Arab kind of party with appreciating approaches towards these kind of pan-Arab causes. Up until, I think, now. And this is one of the important factors in which they start changing. During the 1957 Lebanese elections, the community is very divided. Of course, the government rigs the elections with American help. There is enough evidence for that. And of course, everybody is elected. And the Tashnak voters do really play a great role in defeating some Sunni candidates. The government gerrymanders the district in such a way that they know that the Tashnak party's votes will lead into will help the defeat of radical Nasserist Arab Sunni candidates. And there is also a division of policy. The Sanjians and the Ramgavars are against Nasser's foreign policy. When the revolution happens in Iraq in July, especially the newspaper Ara of the Sanjian is elated with lots of articles saying, how great this revolution is. The fact that the editor was once kicked out of Iraq 20 years earlier as a communist also plays a role in that. But in a way, you see how very different the interpretations are. Comes 1960, there are the 2 blocks. But now the new government of Lebanon is playing a very moderate pro-Nasser policy. And the Tashnaks actually have the support of the government, and the Sanjians and Ramgavars have to go with the opposition. The opposition which is opposed to the government's policy of, having a moderate attitude towards Abdel Nasser. But Sanjian and Ramgavar newspapers say, we have nothing against the president's foreign policy. Our only problem is that they're putting their faith on the Tashnaks, etc. So in any case, gradually a certain base of commonality happens. Another one is the issue of raising the issues of internal lands. Gradually after 1954, Sanjians, Ramgavars, communists, etc. are invited to visit Armenia. All of them come with the feeling that not everything is perfect in Armenia. And in all the family histories, you write all the glowing things that the country is good, but then privately you also start criticizing. My grandpa went in 1965, for example. He was the first member of the family to go through. And I met younger people. I was 10 when he died, so I didn't have the chance to interrogate him about his own experiences. But I met people who were, as a sports team, the younger members of the sports team who were with them. And they say, yes, he was quite disappointed. He expected to see a brighter Armenia. And so even those who were, in a way, and when he came back, everybody said privately, what do you think? And he says, the problem with the Soviet regime, it is just encouraging its own people to become thieves, in the sense of, trying to make use of state property, as you all know, in various means. Of course, the other way around, the Tashnaks start saying that when they start going to Armenia, it's not as bad as they used to think. So gradually, a certain kind of a perspective that people already know about what they're talking about, the Soviet Union, and there is not that kind of reason to be so strongly against one another. But also, this has nothing to do with the Armenian civil history, but for me, it's a very interesting thing. In the background, it's the Catholicosate of Kilikia in Antelias, where in 1956, a new pro-Western, pro-Tashnak Catholicos was there. In the front, 2 years later, these are American tanks, which were in Lebanon in the summer of 1958 to actually protect the pro-Western president. Of course, there were Lebanese government tanks on the day of the election of the Catholicos later on, but in any case, this really shows that how much the Cold War's international and the Armenian aspects to some extent get intertwined. And of course, if you look at the newspapers, the interpretation of what the Americans are doing in Lebanon is very different between the Tashnag and the non-Tashnag newspapers. So in that sense, gradually from the 1960s, we have changes happening. And this really fits in very well with one of the Cold War periodizations. There are many of them, but one of them considers the period of early 1960s as the dividing line between the early part of the Cold War and the later part of the Cold War, roughly coinciding with the Cuban Missile Crisis, though not necessarily totally because of that. It says that after 1960s, as more and more South American, African, and Asian countries get involved in global Cold War politics, what is also very evident is that they start paying less attention to Soviet or American ideology. And there is an assertion of nationalism and trying to find ways in between. Internationally, there's the non-aligned movement, yes, and there are so many local versions of, nationalisms, pro-West or pro-East, who did not want to totally break with the other part and maintain some kind of a liaison. It is called identitarianism, coming from the word identity. And this can be applied to the Armenian case, I think, because in the 1960s, and here again, a very important date comes to make the people to make important decisions. Yesterday we talked about April 24th being so fundamental for Serge Sarkisyan to resign on the 23rd, yeah, that if the next day was another day, probably the decision would have been delayed because of all that loaded issue of the April 24th coming in Armenia with the seats. Now 1965 was in front and everybody was getting ready for it for years. I think we have to write the prehistory of this. Nobody has done. For example, accidentally I saw in 1961 in the newspaper Ararat, which is the Hanchagian newspaper in Beirut, when I was looking for something else, a news item from Buenos Aires, that locally the local various political parties have marked the April 24th together. Something, by the way, which the Lebanese had done on a few occasions before 1939, not every year, but there have a few occasions which they had done before, under the auspices of the church. But now that the church was divided, it was impossible. So, and the newspaper Aratz adds an introduction, as if one day we hope we can do this in Lebanon too, an aspiration. There is the issue of the Karabakh and Nakhichevan demands. As Armenians go more and more into, Armenians from diaspora go to visit Armenia, they see that those issues are being raised. The Hanchagians and the Ramgavars start raising the issue, others do. When they do that, I remember Simon Varatsian writes an article in Astag and says, the Hanchagians have started to speak Tashnagese. Tashnageren gechosin. They're saying the same things that we used to say. And then the Arab newspaper says, well, we always had these aspirations, but we always thought that we have to be careful because people we don't know what the people in Armenia thought about these things. Now we are there, we went there, we know that they have these aspirations, they want us to speak about those aspirations, and we are speaking about these aspirations. And one of the cartoonists, although I have not found the original, I really want, I think Masis, Aradian, draws a very beautiful cartoon. I don't have it, otherwise I would have showed it. Is the editor of Astag, the Tashnag newspaper, and the editor of Arat, the Hanchagian newspaper in Beirut, shoulder to shoulder, both crying, and underneath, out of their tears, is the borders of historic Armenia that they are demanding. It's identitarianism. And it gradually comes to this issue. Look, the Soviet issue is a divide, but it should not prevent us from pursuing our own issue, which is the genocide issue. And that gradually develops into the second stage of the Cold War, what I really consider to be the détente. And the problem is that none of the people who are actually in the decision-making process are already alive. I tried to track very old party people. All of them said, we were at that time not at the very high positions. We don't know the details of the internal negotiations, or we can tell you about the mood. For example, one of the my Tashnak interlocutors, who's now in his mid-80s, said, I was very encouraged by the way the Soviets had started talking about Armenian history and the Battle of Sadarabad, etc. And yes, we became more and more readier to talk with them on these issues now that we saw a softening on those issues. So I think creating the cultural history is very easy to do, but actually to write the diplomatic intra-party history, that will be very difficult to do as well. And this is a photo of that, maybe the symbolic moment when Beirut was the capital of the Armenian diaspora in April 1965, when all the parties together come together and mark the event. It's also very interesting that they failed to agree on a common manifesto, because they cannot agree what will happen to Armenia if we liberate it from the Turks. Should it be independent or should it be part of the Soviet Union? But it's very interesting. They asked the churches to organize the event. So in the church, of course, manifesto and programs, there are nothing about the church. Each one of them says its own opinion. It's again, let's work together as much as we can, and then we'll think what will happen, which is something which has continued very much over the last 60 years or so. I have likened this to the issue of elite settlement, which is a concept that was developed in international politics. And I think it could be applied to some extent about how this was. But yet again, I don't have a lot of let's say, factual material in order to see how that settlement was negotiated between the various members of the elite. That it was negotiated in Beirut in the 1960s, that's very evident, but of course we don't have much. And what we have is an Armenian détente, and that détente hasn't changed that much even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so basically the way the political organizations deal with one another is a product of the mid-1960s, and we still are with there, and we haven't done much progress on that, unfortunately. And this is partly why we still cannot talk about the Cold War, because everybody sticks to its own version of who is to blame, and nobody feels secure enough to discuss who is to blame. So I just talked about whether the Soviets are to blame or the Tashnaks are to blame. We will probably never have a public discussion. Let's discuss this, for the sake of knowing our history better, because people are still not ready yet for that kind of a feeling. But it is also interesting that this Armenian détente outlived the global détente. In the 1980s, many of you will remember, I do remember, after the invasion of Afghanistan, especially under Reagan, until Gorbachev came, there were very tense years of the Cold War. And it was known as the Second Cold War. In Armenian case, we do not have a necessarily sharpening of differences at that time. Although there is a little more attention by Soviets and Americans on Armenians, that has to be studied, but not that much. And finally, the Cold War was practically over with Gorbachev. Not with glasnost and perestroika, but with a third component of Gorbachev's ideology, which we don't talk much about it, novoye myshlenie, or new thinking. The new thinking basically said that the class-based divide is no longer important, and there are universal issues, whether you are communist or non-communist, etc., you can work together. It opened the way for the Tashnaks to be accepted in Armenia as another partner, and that gradually happened in parallel with the Karabakh movement. I think it would have happened even without the Karabakh movement as well, but it happened at around that time. And if we are going to say a year when everything was put in its place, was probably late 1988, early 1989, when the Armenian Cold War was over, in the sense that Armenian government in Yerevan, still a Soviet government, decided to work with everybody at an equal distance. And technically there was no reason in the diaspora after the end of the Soviet regime for the parties to take fixed positions. Of course, they have taken positions for or against various presidents and prime ministers in Armenia, but it has never been that kind of fixed divide, so it's no longer that important a case. So, trying to firstly, why do we fear studying the Cold War? Why do I hope that more people will watch this online, because I have very little expectation that anybody except Krikor Moskofian or a few other universities will invite me to talk about this, is because I think there are two main reasons. One is the Armenian self-image, that united we are stronger. So if we write our own history, we should write all those episodes where we were united, and through our unity we achieved a lot. So we should not really study that much about our divisions, because they are not good examples. And basically we write history as examples of good deeds that you should know about. It goes back to Khorenatsi, yes? You have to read that the great deeds that our fathers did, that should be inspirations for us. In this sense, it's very problematic. Why are you scratching old wounds? This is something that we hear quite a lot. Because while everybody does agree that it was wrong to have this, and everybody will say it was wrong, nobody is ready to take responsibility that his own role was on anything but only reactive. They started it, and we had to do it. And this is still very much the way. If there are references to the history of Cold War in party political writing, it's usually in that way as well. And secondly, of course, it's the issue of genocide. If the Cold War divides us, we should not talk about it. The way we talk about genocide, it unites us. It puts us in the right position against the evil of Turkish denial, and we have to fight about it and do it. That's why every Armenian organization who organizes an event on the Armenian genocide know that all the other organizations have no problem with that. Yeah? But if you do something on the Cold War, you don't know what the reaction will be. So that's another very important issue of what we are trying to do. And ultimately, many scholars write about the genocide because it is on demand. When we sent out the call for papers, at least 5 or 6 of the papers we accepted were genocide-related papers. We just asked them to frame them within the Cold War context, because ultimately it's that paradigm with which people are being encouraged to look into Armenian history in recent decades. I think ever since the 1980s is a good estimate where the genocide became center stage for scholarship. However, the Cold War is important because the way our institutions function, relate with one another, are not the product of genocide, but they were shaped during the Cold War. And we don't have to. The way our schools are, the way our churches are divided, etc., are all a Cold War era. In the case of Armenia, as I said, this international dimension of the Cold War on the development of Soviet policies is also not being studied, and that paradigm should also be introduced into our work. Thanks very much. I know I talked a little bit long, but it was the first time, and I don't think that I will have many opportunities in other cases to do this. Thanks for bearing with me, and if you have questions, of course, I'll be glad to answer them.
We now have time for questions. If anyone in the audience has any comments or questions or can yeah.
Thanks again for an immensely interesting lecture. And the complexity of the issue, as you emphasized, is frankly forbidding, and I admire you for tackling it, even tackling it, let alone resolving some of the issues. So there are, of course, many questions one can ask, but what I wanted to know about your personal opinion. Of course, as you were pointing out, the Dashnag political party is quite focal in all these problems, let's say. Especially remembering also your first lecture about the agrarian reform and so on, when the Dashnag, in the name of their socialist origination, were quite sympathetic to the Bolsheviks. And then, as you were saying, they split up with Bolshevik Russia, etc. And what I was wondering is this fluctuation of the Dashnag party going pro-communist and then anti-communist, and then, as you said, the CIA documents about DRAW, which is very, very disturbing. So how do you explain this? Is it a matter of power politics and just trying to be always with the winners? Or is there anything more, even psychologically, serious about the Tashnak party in terms of their, ancestors, forefathers, whatever? I mean, what's the problem with the Tashnak political party fluctuating between the left and the right and therefore causing a lot of these problems? Finally, you said, for example, that the reconciliation and so on happened because of the tolerance of the, let's say, or the changes in Soviet Union. But may I point out to you that one of the very important, again, dark pages is the Tashnak leader Marukyan and his famous accord with the Soviets, KGB and so on, to direct the whole party towards more of a sympathy towards their regime. And until now, this act of Marukyan is again covered under veils and veils of, there is no public explanation either by the Tashnak party or any other individual scholar. I don't know if you have any ideas about the Marukyan Accord with the KGB, and which was, I think, the main reason that suddenly, therefore, there is a bit of cooperation in the Armenian diaspora, etc., between the local parties. Thank you.
Well, this needs a whole course on history of the Tashnak party, which I think, compared to the Ramgavars and Sanjians, for a historian, it's a more interesting party to study because it fluctuates. The Sanjians and Ramgavars for 70 years said the Soviet Union will solve our problems. So there's not much to study there. In the case of the Tashnaks and the Bolsheviks, maybe I was not effective in saying that. I did not say that necessarily they were very close to the Bolsheviks. I was just saying that their agrarian programs were not very far from one another. The Tashnaks never liked the Bolsheviks never liked the Tashnaks, and even before 1917. So that was it. In the case of the Tashnaks, I think the most important thing is their nationalism. That is a much more important factor to analyze their politics rather than their socialism. Because all Tashnak members, as I know, are convinced nationalists, but not all of them are convinced socialists. As regards the Marukyan issue, I don't know if there is any accord or not. There is no way in which I will use that word, an agreement. However, from the 1960s, the Tashnak party and the Bolsheviks did have some, not cooperation, but at least face-to-face discussions. We know very little about them, but I'm sure somebody who works in the archives in Armenia should very easily be able to tell the Soviet Armenian part of it. Nobody has done it because there's not much interest, it seems, in Armenia about these issues. I assume that you will find more. To what extent did that lead into, and how did Ara Marukyan see it, and how did relations between the Tashnaks and Moscow and Tashnaks and Yerevan develop? All these things are important things to discuss. I never talked about these things because all I have is very scattered material from sources that I don't think are very trustworthy and reliable. So I hope that this source book that we are going to work within a few years will put these things together, and with different people suggesting different material, probably we will be in a better shape to give a more pinpoint explanation of what was going on. In the case of Tashnaks going from one place to another, as a historian, I don't see anything wrong in that. Because basically they were a party which tried to adapt itself to the circumstances. Not everybody agreed with them, yes, but it still really makes studying them very interesting because they were always in search of certain solutions. Now, the way they treated their rivals or non-Tashnags in diaspora in a somewhat high-handed manner, as their opponents proclaim, it's just another matter compared to what kind of policy you're trying to shape. In the end, this is the Armenian history with all its complexity, and we have to tell it in real time rather than pick and choose what we can in order to further our current agendas today, which unfortunately that is how people relate to history, by just saying, in this year we did this, but well, 2 years later you did something very different. But so that is also an important way to approach this issue. And hopefully, if we go forward with this study, it's not something that I will do myself alone as you, so I'm just trying to encourage other people to join in. I think we will be in a better shape to answer these questions in a more informed manner within the next 5 to 10 years. Felix.
There is a French language book which I can't remember the name of the author, Gdaïs something or other. Yeah, because I think he spoke to Maroukian and
Yes.
he detailed some of the meetings they had. So, that might have more information.
Well, some of those meetings, the early ones, are also in the memoirs of Antranik Urfalian, who was the member of the ARF Bureau, the Tashnag Bureau, during the first 2 meetings, which occurred very late in the 1960s. And altogether, information came about during that polemic that went on between President Bedrosian and the Tashnag leadership in the early 1990s. So there is some information. But I believe that in the Soviet archives there should be information, because I'm sure that those who went to negotiate with the Tashnags did write a report to the first secretary of the Soviet Armenian Communist Party, which at most of the time was either Anton Kochinyan or later on Karen Demirjian, and I'm sure they will be there. For example, I've seen a few issues of the daily briefing that the KGB used to hand in to the Armenian leadership every morning. These are usually 1.5 pages long, telling what is the operative situation in the Republic. And they include a lot of issues. I'm sure they would have informed on these things as well. It's just generating that kind of interest in Armenia to look at the history of the diaspora as history. I gave a lecture in Armenian roughly about this topic a few years ago. Unfortunately, we could not post it online because there was a problem with the recording. Otherwise, it would have been online a few years back. And at the end of it, one of my colleagues in the Institute of Ethnography, she told me that after this lecture, I realized for the first time that the diaspora has history. Because usually the way the diaspora has been presented in the Soviet Armenian publications, and it hasn't changed much. It has changed very little in the last couple of decades, is it presented as an inventory, in the sense that in this community, the Armenians have 4 churches, 6 schools, 7 organizations, etc., and very little about the changing dynamics of various issues. Like today, I didn't talk much about it, but at that time I talked about the relationship between the Tashnag Party and ANCHA, that organization which used to encourage immigration towards the Western countries. Initially, it was cooperation, but later on it turned into antagonism. So all these kind of things will come up, and hopefully, as I said, our conference will be a gateway, and the source book will be much more important. And I hope that people who will go into that website will also suggest ideas and things, and we can really have a good source book, initially online, and maybe later on we can publish it in a form of a book format for lay readers in 1 or 2 volumes. So there's a lot to do.
Could I just say on what you said about the later Soviet period, yes. I was actually very surprised reading documents from the KGB and the government from the late 1980s, yes. Badamyants and the other yes. KGB leaders. They were very hostile to the mood of nationalism. They're very fearful that this would undermine the Soviet government in Armenia. And there was no sense that they agreed with the demands over Karabakh yes. or anything like that. And I had presumed that they'd more or less gone over to the nationalist agenda. But even into 1989, quite late on, I was very surprised that they were maintaining a 100% Soviet line. We must crush these people who are enemies of the Soviet system. The problem with reading documents without being able to talk to the people is, were they saying this because they knew they could have been read in Moscow or whatever, and they were therefore keeping to the line?
You answered what I was going to say. I have also worked as a bureaucrat in the university, and I write annual reports to my supervisor, and I know who is going to read it. So I don't always write exactly the way I feel. I always write to make it effective, to get something from my supervisor, more money, more attention, or whatever, in any institution. So that has to be taken into consideration. And also, they could now tell you things totally differently from what they felt at that time. So I think that's why history is a big problem. The Karabakh movement's 30th anniversary was marked earlier this year. And one thing which was very interesting, and I shared it with some journalists who deal with historical issues in Yerevan, that totally the voice of the Communist Party was totally missing. That the story was being told by the people who were in the vanguard of the movement. And we never talked about those people who were in official positions. And of course, all those in those official positions would have said, oh, under the table, I used to help them. So it will be a very complex thing. And we will have a serious lack of documentation in the future if we want to give there. So that's why, again, I was talking to the same people now, that you should actually document what is happening now from both sides of barbed wire. This is the word that I used. And he said, well, yes, but if we write anything, they would just tell us that you are making propaganda for Nikol Pashinyan. I said, okay, but now you have to collect this information, even if you're going to publish it 2 years later, because many of these things will be lost. And so many of the history of the Karabakh movement has already been lost, in the sense that I also have my own views of how I had to deal as a diaspora student, a young man, encouraged with the movements, with the leaders of the Komsomol in our university, the clashes we had, to the extent they helped us, to the extent that they put limits to us, to the extent that they respected the limits that they put, which I have to also say, they said, if you do these things, you can do it. And they allowed us to do certain things. It was not total repression. So building that history will be very, very, very important. But unfortunately, most of our historiography is single voice. And that probably will change. And hopefully the new government and the new education minister, when I yesterday said that I am excited, I am hopeful, I hope that these things will have a positive way in which we write our own history in a much more complex manner. I have some reasons to believe that is true, and I really, really want that it will happen in the future.
Thank you very much, Ara. One of the things that I want to mention as well regarding Lebanese civil war, so-called civil war, which as well I think created lots of settling down all these issues. Can you comment on that? And the other thing as well, Kahti Panak.
Well, you mean the Lebanese civil war of the 1975?
Yes, 1975.
Well, by 1975, that identitarian issue was already very strong, in the sense that although electorally the Tashnaks and their rivals had supported competing camps during the pre-war period, when it came to the war, one thing which the Armenians stuck to and observed it to the end was that we will not kill one another. 1958 will not be repeated. And we can say that generation after generation, every crisis that we go through in Lebanon in recent years, that issue is reconfirmed, reasserted, etc. And we should observe that these people have been holding to their words, yes? And no Armenian thinks that for any cause related to outside the community is worth the blood of another Armenian. So in that sense, I think it's the gradual outgrowth of the identitarian issue. It also helped further consolidation on the broader issues, especially in the late 1970s, when still Lebanon was still the center. But from the 1980s, it started using its centrality, especially when the Tashnak Party leadership took its offices to Athens, etc. So Lebanon started losing that. The issue of the let's say, underground movements which assassinated Turkish politicians. On purpose, I never use the word terrorism in any case, because it has become a very loaded word. There were papers in the conference about them, and also on the cover of our program, one of the 5 or 6 photos were those of the 5 young men who, according to official history, blew themselves up in Lisbon as they were trying to take over the local Turkish embassy, the Lisbon 5, as they are glorified, especially by the Tashnaks. This was part of it, but yet again there are lots of complex issues here. Evidently there was an international dimension to both the justice commanders of the Armenian genocide and also to Asala, but again it's very difficult to analyze them, and also it's very difficult to put them within the classical divide of the Armenian diaspora. Technically you can put Asala in the anti-Tashnak camp, and maybe see the struggle that went on the streets of Beirut between the Tashnaks and Asala in 1985-86, I think these were the years, when, according to my count, something like 10 to 15 men lost their lives as part of the continuation of the conflict, but then the traditional other forces were aloof, the AGBU, the Sanjians, and the Ramgavars. To what extent the issue of the Soviet Union comes up into it, again, it has to be studied further. That's why I didn't want to go into details of this, because I hope that such a project will encourage more and more people to write about these things in the future.
Any other questions? If there are no more questions...
May I be allowed another one?
Should definitely, yes.
Thank you very much, because it's a very complex issue, and especially Alex is here. I just read the bit about the Mitrokhin archives, and I was wondering what you think of it. Sometimes we kind of are overwhelmed by stereotypes about, secret services and so on. I find KGB's sort of recruitment of some of the Lebanese Armenians who I used to know quite ridiculous and laughable. I just cannot understand what, secondary poet Sanjian, who still lives in London, could have provided the KGB with any information, and whether, for example, Zarugian of the famous Nairi Weekly, who was a prominent Tashnak, although dissident Tashnak, could have been a KGB agent. I think
there are more important, more interesting figures. I will not go into details because we're touching about names of some people whose children still have not seen Felix's list and they don't know that their dads are there.
No, what I was trying to say is that I find it, if it is true, I have my doubts about the Mitrokhin archives, because the man has, there is absolutely no original document from the archives. The man has produced remarkably, what a memory, all from his memory,
Is it memory?
Yeah.
No, it's not memory.
I thought that's, sorry, yes, because I thought that is what I read in your article.
No, what he did was copied out little bits from documents. He didn't copy whole documents, so it's very frustrating. I think the KGB did recruit a lot of people, but they wanted to recruit anyone they felt would be useful. But the archives that Mitrokhin copied mostly didn't say what the people did. So you've got no idea, and you can see quite often the KGB cut these people loose. They no longer kept contact with them because they realized it was a waste of time. But quite often they needed people to provide documentation about identities so they could create a fictional person who could act as their spy. They were quite obsessed by this. So particularly priests and so on who had access to registry documents about individuals, they could give them, a false identity they could use. But, these were also people only who came in contact with the Moscow KGB, because that's where Mitrokhin worked. So what the Armenian KGB itself was doing, I think they were trying to find out about what the local Armenian dynamics were in Beirut or wherever. But from Moscow's perspective, they wanted to use anyone they could for Soviet aims. But I think it's true what Mitrokhin wrote. I think he did not make it up. I think it's genuine. There were so many things that even I found which he could not have known if he hadn't been in that position. But what these people did and whether they harmed anyone, I don't know.
I will not identify individuals. I will just say a few things that I think some of the people mentioned on the list did, without identifying some. In one case, I think it would have been a post office, in the sense that he received mail, although he was related by marriage to a very influential Tashnak party member. I don't know if that was important. But post. In other case, I was quite sure, and we talked about people, that probably he informed the KGB on something totally apolitical, though, about smuggling that was used to go on through tourism, etc., in Armenia, because he had a lot of contacts in the business circles and probably knew who wanted to smuggle in or out gold, pearls, and other things which people used to do. In one case, he was a representative of a pharmaceutical company. He had a lot of contacts among the physicians in Beirut. So he could have been used to identify those who have pro-left-wing views so that they could actually contact them, etc. There will be. The other issue is that, if I read Felix correctly, is that there are two groups here, the agents and the trusted informants. Well, I could have very easily been a trusted informant in the sense that they knew that I come from a family which is not Tashnak and an educated person, and maybe they have asked my views about what's going on, as the same way as a journalist or somebody else may have views, but they trusted the judgment of that person, yeah, and so that they can learn. So people like Zarugian and the others may fall into that kind of category as well. So it's very difficult for us to know, especially if somebody is openly pro-Soviet, using him as a spy will be useful that much in any case. So I think we don't have to go into too much detail to this, and it's just a part of what we see with all the, provisos and things that we have to really take into consideration, that it may not be a full thing. But I also want, for us to look into the other secret services as well, because I don't think that all of them were aloof from the Armenians as well on the other side. And I don't know when the Armenian KGB will allow its archives to be scrutinized. Hopefully in the coming decades that people will be able to look into some of the stuff. I don't know. Even in most countries, after 100 years, they're open, and we're close to 100 years to Soviet rule in Armenia, so why still keep closed the archives of the 1920s, for example? I'm not talking about 1970s, 80s, or 90s. So I don't know that there is idealist secrecy still there in Armenia, and we don't know if that kind of Freedom of Information Act and other things will ever come into Armenia to look into this. How many people will be able to talk is another. During my searches, I came across to one moment when a KGB officer, I don't know he worked for Armenia or from Moscow, tells his local Armenian friend that this Russian KGB officer is going to meet you, and for him to lose interest in you, you should say this and this and this and this, so that this will be your last meeting between you two. And he said, I really helped a lot, because we had really become friends, and he really helped me not to fall into that trap. I said what he had told me to answer, and this was the last meeting that we ever had, etc. So in a way, it's a very complex situation, and we have to be very careful. But overall, as a historian, I don't think that espionage plays that an important role in defining the course of world history. It's very interesting for thrillers, etc. It may have some interest, but it will never be the determining factor. So among all the things that I listed espionage, expecting Felix to be here, and I'm glad that he is here. But in the end, it's only a side story of a whole much more complex issue. I don't know, but it's inevitably it has to be done as well. And thanks for him for bringing this information into the public domain, and we're trying to make best use of it in our own research. Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance. Thank you, Dr. Sanjian, for your talk as well, and thank you all for this really interesting, insightful discussion that happened as a result. To everyone following online, please follow us on YouTube, on our MailChimp as well, subscribe, and hopefully see you at our next event. Thank you.